Characters of the Reformation, Part 5. Stephen Gardiner. The figure of Stephen Gardiner is not among the very great figures of the English Reformation, or at any rate not quite in the first flight. On this account it has been in great part neglected, and quite unduly neglected, because although he did not mold events, nor decide the general course of the movement, there is one reason for which all those who desire to understand the great disaster should make themselves well acquainted with this man. This reason is that he was the typical Englishman of his day. If you follow the fortunes of Stephen Gardiner's soul, the fluctuation of his opinion, his utter devotion to national feeling, his original error on this account, his gradual awakening to the peril in which religion lay, his whole career, especially on its spiritual internal side, then you understand the England of the time. Henry the King, impulsive and very vain, was certainly not a typical Englishman. Even Mary Tudor, with her half-Spanish blood and her isolated mind, could not be called typical of the country. Cranmer was not, for he was too much of an artist and much too much of a time-server and a coward to be typical of any ordinary, healthy, normal citizen of any time or place. Elizabeth was still less typical of England, for both by her talents and by her diseases of body and soul she was an abnormality. But Gardiner is the true Englishman of the time in body and mind and everything else. That is his importance. Understanding him, you understand the English Reformation, or rather you understand the kind of average citizen upon whom the catastrophe fell. It is, therefore, a great loss to history that even highly educated men have heard so little of him. For 100 men who have heard of Henry, for 50 who have heard of Cranmer, perhaps one could tell you who Stephen Gardiner was. Stephen Gardiner was born of that solid middle-class parentage which provided so many officials for the Tudor dynasty, especially those clerical officials who were its chief supports. We are not quite fixed on the date of his birth, but it came somewhere latish in the 1480s, that he was a little older than King Henry, and some 5 to 10 years younger than St. Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor. He went through the usual course of those middle-class lads who were destined for the church, a career which in those days led to the highest political positions in men of temporal ability. He took his doctorate of law at Cambridge, and then became Wolsey's secretary. He was a man of about 40 before he appeared in any very considerable political activity, but by that time he was the regular Tudor civil servant of the day. He was a good ecclesiastic, but certainly at that time was putting his political office at least upon an equality with, and probably above his ecclesiastical. So far the man is simply one of a number of others, one of the regular Tudor official lot, rewarded with various ecclesiastical preferments by the kings whom they served. He was a big, strong man, with a square-jawed, heavy face, enlivened, however, by quick, large, and brilliant dark eyes. He was fairly learned. He was a very able controversialist. He was a good speaker, and a man full of health and energy. The divorce business broke out just when he was established in his most important official career, and the government at once used him for their purpose. He had come from Wolsey's household. He had been, as I have said, Wolsey's secretary. And when Wolsey fell, he became secretary to Henry, which meant, of course, that all important official documents passed through his hands, and that his judgment was in most things taken and considered. Into the affair of the divorce he threw himself heartily, acting wholly and simply as the servant of his sovereign. Of the bullying to which the unfortunate Pope was subjected, the most extravagant and violent passages came from Gardiner himself. It was he at Rome who most directly threatened Clement with the danger of schism if he would not grant the divorce. He was wrapped up in the affair altogether without hesitation and without compromise, and the court regarded him as so much their principal agent, and likely to be their most successful one in the business, that he was given the great bishopric of Winchester as early as 1531, that is, long before the great business was decided, and while it was in full swing. The Bishop of Winchester, in those days, was one of the richest men in the kingdom. The office carried with it great political power as well. It had been the chief standby of Wolsey himself, and Gardiner, on obtaining it, became a very great man in English social and political life by mere rank, apart from what his talents and services had already proved him to be. But here we may note a curious point. When it came to the danger of the schism, Gardiner had about him a touch of hesitation. It was only a touch, but it is significant of what was to come. He was still wholeheartedly in favor of that absolute kingly government and of that strong national feeling that which went with it. He was still as much opposed as ever to the political papal claims over temporal sovereigns, and especially over his own sovereign. And when the decision had to be taken, he was ready to accept the primacy of Henry over the Church of England, and even to defend it, as we shall see. Pointed out in the case of St. Thomas More, that to be so far-sighted as to discern what the schism would ultimately mean was granted to very few. The average Englishman was with the king against the Pope in that particular quarrel, hoping vaguely perhaps that it would soon be patched up, as so many others had been, but not connecting it in any way with doctrine. Therefore Gardiner, in every sense the average Englishman, followed the same road. Yet he did show a slight hesitation when the exact formula by which the king's supremacy should be first hinted at was introduced into the debates of the clergy. It should always be remembered in this connection that the royal supremacy was not, in the first steps towards it, represented as schismatical. The full schism was only arrived at by degrees and after a series of steps, each of which, save the last, might be twisted or argued into orthodoxy. Some have said that his hesitation of Gardiner's, slight as it was, caused him to be passed over when Wareham died, and thus made him miss the primacy, the Archbishopric of Canterbury. But this is a false judgment. Not Gardiner, but Cranmer was marked out to be the next archbishop because he was Anne Boleyn's man, her chaplain, and because he was crapulous and would do anything he was told, as the future was to show. Those who think that there was any chance for Gardiner misunderstand the position altogether, and particularly misunderstand the fact that it was Anne and not Henry who was running the whole affair. Anyhow, Stephen Gardiner remained very prominent, the great Bishop of Winchester, full of wealth and power. He accepted the supremacy. What is more, a year after the full schism had appeared, that is, in 1535, he engaged his responsibility up to the hilt by writing a tract in favor of a schismatic policy, the famous tract De Vera Obedientia, concerning true obedience. There is a characteristic letter of him to Bucer, the continental reformer, in which he gives us an example of the excellence of the royal supremacy compared with the papal supremacy, on account of the better discipline it enforced throughout the Church of England. The king, he says, can strictly enforce the observation for celibacy, for instance, and can sharply correct the manners of his own clergy, while the Pope, under the circumstances of the time, where the churches had become so largely national, was lacking in effective power. In a word, Gardiner, in spite of that first half hesitation, was then, 1534, wholeheartedly for Henry's position, for the royal supremacy in things spiritual as well as temporal, and therefore, in practice, for the schism. And so he remained for years. He was a man of over 60 before he learnt the lesson, which all ultimately learnt, that there can be no Catholicism without the Pope. To the modern mind that, of course, is a truism. Indeed, today, with so many people outside the Church aping Catholicism and so many more interesting themselves in this or that aspect of Catholicism, it is a matter of course that the ultimate test of Catholicism is the acceptation of the Pope's authority. But we must always remember in reading of this period of the English Reformation, this main point of neglect of which makes it incomprehensible, that the papal claims were debated and had been debated for generations within the Catholic Church itself before the breakup of Christendom in the great disaster of the 16th century. What with the political entanglements of temporal power, the Pope's political action as a mere Italian prince, the very large sums taken by the papacy in direct taxation from all countries, and the worldly character of too many popes of the day, some of them an open scandal, it needed the experience of disunion to prove the necessity of union, and to prove in especial that the test of unity was obedience to the See of Peter. When Bayard made his famous remark, "One can be a good Catholic without the Pope," he was saying what millions of men had said before consequences had taught them the contrary, and before the experience of what disunion would lead to had frightened them into full orthodoxy. Meanwhile, Stephen Gardiner, like Henry himself, was intensely Catholic in doctrine and practice, as opposed to the Lutheran, and still more as opposed to the Calvinist. And this endeared him to Henry, though Henry dreaded the strength and activity of his character. Gardiner always stood for the defense of the old national traditions in religion, of the Mass, of course, but also of the full doctrine of the real presence, and so down to the minor devotions of Catholic practice. When the violent discussions broke out among Henry's bishops, some of whom, led by Cranmer and under the protection of Cromwell, became more and more anti-Catholic in tone, Gardiner put all his weight into the scale to oppose the breakup. He was largely responsible for, and perhaps in part framed, the famous 6 Articles which during the last years of Henry's reign, enforced Catholic doctrine and practice under heavy penalties. On account of this, it was when Henry died in 1547, and that unscrupulous gang, first under Somerset and then under Northumberland, fell like harpies onto the remaining property of the church to fill their pockets, thoroughly supported the religious revolutionaries. Gardiner was clearly a public danger to them, for he was the spokesman of what the mass of Englishmen felt. They imprisoned him, and they deprived him of his bishopric, and so he remained persecuted and a victim of the effort to impose a new religion by terror upon the English. He was naturally the hero of all that great bulk of the nation which detested the new revolutionary doctrines, and which rose in armed rebellion throughout the land against the new-fangled Protestant service. Gardiner's name became the symbol of the older and better state of things, the return of which men so ardently desired. We shall see how when the diseased little Edward was dead, Mary took Gardiner out of the Tower and raised him to the highest political position in England, making him her chancellor, that is, much more even than what we should call today prime minister. And Gardiner now bore witness to the fullness of his faith. There was no process of recantation, still less any trace of political motive. That which he had never thought possible, the presence of an anti-Catholic government in England, the destruction of the Mass, the unscrupulous despoiling of guild property, the oversetting of all shrines, the wanton destruction of the churches, had proved to him what the fruits of disunion might be. But for the schism, which he had approved, such things could not have come to pass. And now he was determined to undo the schism, and worked with all his might for the restoration of England to the unity of Christendom, which he had the privilege to see accomplished before he died. As he died, he gave the famous cry, "I denied as Peter did, I went out as Peter did, but I have not wept as Peter did." He was fortunate indeed to live to such a moment, and fortunate, I think, also in dying before he could see all the good work swept away. For he passed on the 12th of November, 1555, overshadowed indeed by some dread of the future, but not witnessing the breakdown which followed 3 years later on Mary's death. What overshadowed him was his fear of the results of the Spanish marriage. He had been again typically English in his stout resistance to that policy. It was he who had urged upon the Queen the advisability of marrying one of her own English nobles, and if Courtenay had had a better character, he would have carried his point. This opposition to Mary's Spanish marriage put him in a minority in the council, and he had to give way. Indeed, the marriage with Philip was solemnized in his own cathedral and by Gardiner himself. There is one last point to be made with regard to him, and that is his attitude towards the prosecutions of the revolutionaries for heresy rather than for treason. Because he was chancellor, because he was Mary's right-hand man and the most prominent of the Catholic protagonists, the symbol of tradition in the national religion, he was until recently almost universally accused by our official historians of particular harshness and even cruelty in the treatment of the heretics after the new policy began. Now, what was his real attitude towards it? We have no need for reluctance in the matter. The government had a perfect right to treat a small rebel minority which was working for the destruction of religion and of the monarch as well, as public enemies. It was rather a matter of policy than of morals whether the rebels should be treated as heretics or as traitors. But was Gardner, as a fact, prominent in the persecutions? Was he a leading spirit in them? It may be doubted or even denied. As Chancellor, it was, of course, his business to preside over the affair, but it is to be remarked that he took pains to save men from the consequences of their error, that he personally helped some of those most endangered to escape from the country, and in his own great diocese there were no executions. That was due, in part, of course, to the fact that the poison had not reached the western country parts over which that diocese extended. It was only virulent in London, one or two seaport towns, and certain sections of East Anglia and the home countries. But still, from all that we know of the nature of the man and of his policy and other things, we may fairly conclude that if he had had a free hand, he would have been in favor of Philip of Spain's policy, and not of that of the council. He would, I think, had he had a free hand, have made a few examples by prosecuting for treason, but he would have prevented the wholesale prosecutions for heresy. For that was what Mary's Spanish husband had urged, to repress treason rather than heresy. But Paget and the council, to show their English independence, rejected the foreigners' counsel. Such, I say, should be, I think, our general conclusion. But we must not run to the extreme of saying that he was an overt opponent to the policy of prosecuting and executing for heresy. He certainly was not that. When it was once undertaken, he carried it out, and nothing by way of public pronouncement fell upon him to show that he objected. He did not, for instance, openly oppose it, as he had openly opposed the Spanish marriage. Such was Stephen Gardner, a character then most national, which more than any other helps us to grasp, when we are fully acquainted with it, the character of the time in which he lived, and especially the attitude of the normal Englishman in those difficult and confused days. There was no one to succeed him. There was no other typical national figure to symbolize the reluctance and the distaste everywhere profoundly felt for the new and fanatical movement against the ancient national traditions of England. Had there been one such, one of similar authority and with as great a past, in the first years of Elizabeth's reign, Cecil would perhaps not have undertaken with the same success the evil work he did. Mary Tudor. Most of the leading characters of the English Reformation have been presented to modern readers in a distorted fashion. In the case of those who were the most important, such as Thomas Cromwell or William Cecil, this distortion results in a false impression of the whole movement. Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's eldest child and only legitimate daughter, was not one of those characters which mainly molded the Reformation period one way or the other. She was more acted upon than acting, but as her character had been more distorted than that of any other, it is both of interest and importance for our judgment of the time to get it right. The reason that her character has been more distorted than any other is this: she was the most strongly orthodox Catholic of all the principal figures of the time. When she came to the throne, she stood for the great mass of the nation in this respect. For the great mass of the nation was, of course, wholly Catholic, and in 1553, when she acceded, and could not imagine it could ever become anything else. It was under her government that the prosecution of the religious revolutionaries, who were also social and political revolutionaries, was carried out with the most activity. On these accounts the English writers, when England had become Protestant long after, tended to make Mary Tudor a more active figure than she was, because they tended to make her villainous of the peace. A ridiculous picture was drawn of a vindictive fanatical woman attempting to repress the universal dislike of Catholicism by a sort of reign of terror. Her short reign is still called, in the official English histories at Oxford and Cambridge, the Marian reaction, as though the English people were then progressing in a tide towards Protestantism, and the short 6 years of Mary's reign were a mere abortive and cruel effort to check a great national movement. All that, of course, is absurdly false. Of all the falsehoods of our official history, it is perhaps the one falsehood most widely divorced from reality. There was no national movement towards Protestantism. The Queen was popular. The prosecution and execution of the religious revolutionaries excited no national protest. But the curious thing is that those who should be the defenders of true, that is, Catholic, history, have helped to perpetrate the legend by doing no more than answer individual points in it, and not dealing with its falsity as a whole. For instance, they point out that if Mary persecuted, she was only acting according to the spirit of the time; that if she put to death a great number of Protestants, so under Elizabeth were to put to death a great number of Catholics, and so on. They imply the whole time that the main thesis of their opponents is true, namely, that England was already Protestant, or at least was divided into two halves, Protestant and Catholic, that the initiative in the executions proceeded from Mary herself, and that her government had no right to check rebellion. When you meet the falsehood of an opponent by picking holes in the details of what he says, while still admitting his general thesis, you only confirm the error which he desires to propagate. The right way of meeting false propaganda is by the statement of the truth and the vigorous erection of a true picture which shall cancel the false one. The true picture of Mary Tudor is that of a woman simple in character, like her mother, somewhat warped by isolation, devout, thoroughly virtuous, led of necessity by her all-powerful counsel, but in some points insisting upon her own will, without too much judgment. She was also a woman suffering, like all Henry's children, from bad health and dying early, a woman who was thoroughly representative in her religion of the bulk of the nation, and yet who was somewhat out of touch with the spirit of the nation in important matters, such as that of her Spanish marriage. It is further true that had she lived a few years longer, England would probably be Catholic today, and had she had a child, England would certainly be Catholic today. For the English people had always loved her, and always regarded her as the true queen, and would not have tolerated the rivalry of anyone against her descendants. Mary Tudor was born in 1516, on February 18th, when Henry and his wife Catherine of Aragon had been happily married for less than 7 years, when the young king was still devoted to his wife, and when everything was going well. Queen Catherine had had great misfortunes in the matter of childbirth. Children stillborn or dying immediately after birth, and 1 or 2 miscarriages. When therefore it was seen that the child would survive, it was a matter of great rejoicing to the king and to the whole nation, of which she became a sort of idol. Henry hoped, of course, for a male heir, but as none came, he and the nation took it for granted that the little princess would ultimately become one of those great queens who were so conspicuous a mark of the period, like her grandmother, Isabella of Castile. Then came the tragedy of Henry's infatuation for Anne Boleyn. We shall never understand Mary's character unless we appreciate the fact that she grew up under the influence of that tragedy, just in those years when strong emotions are felt and the whole character is formed. She was a very intelligent, very well-educated, sensitive child in her 12th year, devoted to her mother, and standing in affectionate awe of her father, who doted on her. When the first news of a sort which could be told to a child came to her of Anne's disgraceful power over the king. She was in her 14th year when the great trial was held under Wolsey and Campeggio in London, by which Henry hoped to obtain his divorce from her mother, Queen Catherine. She was already quite able to understand everything that was happening, and to burn with indignation against the abominable way in which her mother was being treated. She was a woman grown in her 18th year, when Anne Boleyn was crowned queen, and was therefore in a position to heap indignity and insult not only on the legitimate queen, who was now exiled from court, but on the legitimate heiress to the English throne, Mary herself. It was at such an age, 18, that Mary saw the illegitimate child of her mother's rival, the baby Elizabeth, proclaimed heiress to England and herself legally bastardized. Finally, when she lost her chief support by her mother's death, she was within 6 weeks of her 20th birthday. All that youth of hers had been passed in one preoccupation of the shameful affair, which was bitterly disastrous and humiliating to her. Her father would have renewed his relations of affection with her if he could, but he was too weak, and Anne Boleyn always interfered. Henceforth she was utterly lonely, and could depend for counsel and advice upon no one in the kingdom, only upon her cousin, the great Emperor Charles V, 16 years older than herself, and the head of her mother's family. She stood out as best she could against the schism, but in her bewilderment and under the strain of perpetual pressure, gave way, and in a tragic moment admitted Henry's supremacy, though in her heart, of course, she never accepted it. So long as Henry lived, that is, till the year 1547, by which time Mary Tudor was a woman of nearly 31 and already marked by permanent grief, she remained in this anomalous position, and further troubles began with the accession to power of the gang of harpies who looted the royal domain and the church under her little half-brother, Edward VI. They tried to interfere with her practice of her religion, and indeed she was only maintained in that by the active intervention of her cousin, the emperor. When the deceased little lad died, an effort was made by Cranmer, Cecil, and Dudley, and the rest, to substitute Lady Jane Grey for Mary's legitimate claim to the throne. They tried to trap Mary into coming to London, where they would certainly have imprisoned her and probably put her to death. She showed the greatest courage. Her cousin the emperor advised her to take refuge on the continent. She refused to do so. She made a prodigious ride of 2 days away from London eastward, and there was an enthusiastic popular rising in her favor which destroyed the plans of the conspirators. But here came the crisis. She could not reign without the great nobles, the very same people who had conspired against her. They were too powerful for her to do without them. She did, indeed, release from prison and take for her principal adviser the great Bishop Gardiner, but she had to admit to the council much the same sort of men as those who had been guilty of the orgy of loot of church property under her little brother's nominal reign. She had to accept as an accomplished fact the millions they enjoyed out of the robbery of the church, and she could not but feel all the time that her position was one of compromise. Popular though she was with the mass of the English people, and highly accomplished, she was handicapped in person, and with no experience of the world, and had had little training in the judgment of character. She was, as I have said, of bad health. She was short, prematurely aged, in her 38th year, but looking 15 years older, and had a rough, deep voice almost like a man's, a head too big for her body, and altogether an unimpressive presence. And in her relations with the men and women about her she was much too ready to believe in the good and to doubt the evil. This was especially the case in her relations with her younger, illegitimate sister, Elizabeth. That young woman, only 20 when Mary came to the throne, was the figurehead at once of the small revolutionary party in religion, and all of those thousands of newly enriched men, among whom they now divided the spoils of the church. They accepted in Parliament, which was entirely composed of their class, the reconciliation with Rome, but only on condition that they could keep the monastic lands, and each of them would certainly have felt more secure in his ill-gotten gains with Elizabeth instead of Mary on the throne. At the very beginning of her reign, the matter of her marriage went wrong. It was imperative that she should be married soon, and that there should be an heir to the throne. Gardiner, her chancellor and chief minister, advised a marriage with a semi-royal cousin, Courtenay, the only suitable native candidate. But he was quite a young man, dissolute and therefore repulsive to her. She decided against Gardiner's advice, and after much hesitation and repeated prayer, she determined to marry her cousin Philip, the emperor's son, whom she had been given the kingdom of Spain and the Netherlands, a man 15 years younger than herself. This marriage was somewhat unpopular throughout England, but was especially so in London and the home countries. It was most unpopular with the rich, because throughout Europe the quarrel of the Reformation was now long established, and Philip, standing as he did as the head of the Catholic cause, seemed to endanger the continued possession by the new millionaires of the church lands which they had stolen in England. The discontent was fanned by the French king and his ambassador in London, because the marriage would increase the power of Spain, France's rival at the time. There was an insurrection which very nearly succeeded, backed with French money and French guns. It was launched under the promise that there would be a French invasion in aid of it. This insurrection, called Wyatt's Rebellion, was put down. But Mary was far too merciful on this occasion. She spared her young half-sister Elizabeth, who was undoubtedly mixed up in the affair, and she believed Elizabeth when the princess declared herself wholeheartedly Catholic and disavowed the religious revolutionaries. But those revolutionaries were now not only religious, they were also political revolutionaries, and many of them social revolutionaries as well. During the 6 years of Edward VI's nominal reign, they had had their way. They had tasted power, and it gave them courage. Moreover, the sincerely religious enthusiasts among them had an intensity of feeling which made them exceedingly dangerous. Philip, now King of England side by side with the Queen, was, on the advice of his father the Emperor, strongly in favor of dealing with the danger as a purely civil and political one. His chaplain was ordered to preach a sermon advising toleration, his idea and that of the emperor being that the revolutionaries should be dealt with as traitors rather than heretics. But the council, which in those days was the real governing power, was exasperated by seeing a foreign prince acting as their rival, and, largely out of opposition to him, they determined upon the opposite policy, to which Mary herself was quite willing to accede. They would try to put down the revolutionaries as heretics rather than traitors. When, therefore, a sermon was preached by one of the fanatics praying for the Queen's death, instead of getting the culprit hanged for treason, which would probably have been the wiser course, they proceeded to inaugurate a policy of prosecutions for heresy. For one man who would have risked death under the infamous charge of reason, there were 10 who were ready to offer themselves as martyrs for various forms of intense anti-Catholicism, principally Calvinist. Therefore, the council's original hope that a few executions would be sufficient to suppress the revolutionary movement failed. And though the executions were restricted to a comparatively small part of England, they were numerous and continuous. They were especially numerous in London, which was the one great town of the kingdom, the one place where opinion could easily be inflamed, and where also was the chief strength of this small religious minority. The North and the West were almost untouched, and the Midlands were not seriously disaffected. In this way, the last half of Mary's reign was filled with the perpetual attempt to suppress the revolutionary movement as a religious rather than as a political thing. A few more years of persecution would almost certainly have been successful, but it was cut off short by Mary's death at the end of 1558, when she had reigned only 5.5 years. It is significant that the chief promoter of these burnings was Paget, a man personally indifferent in religion, but himself one of the new millionaires filled with church loot. It is significant also that the council was so determined in its policy, in order to show its power against Philip, that its members even took advantage of Mary's illness to try and put to death one of her own favorites, whom she with difficulty saved. But all the while it must be remembered that Mary herself remained personally popular, especially with the poorer people, with whom she mixed humbly and charitably, while her undoubted position as legitimate in birth and true queen was enthusiastically acclaimed to the end. Philip, soon after the marriage, had left for the continent, where his presence was necessary in the war against France. The queen was supposed to be with child. Everything was made ready for the birth, but it was a false alarm. She was not pregnant, but suffering from the dropsy from which she died. Her death was very holy and beautiful. She died as her mother had died, hearing the Mass which was being said in her death chamber in the early hours of a dark winter's morning. It is a pathetic but pleasant to remember that as she died she said that angel children were about her bed. With her death the whole gang immediately seized power, using Elizabeth, whom she had spared and whom she had regarded as her successor, because she had been deceived by the violent protestations of Catholic loyalty on the part of that princess. With the death of Mary and the advent of Elizabeth began that slow and ultimately successful effort to drive the mass out of England and destroy Catholicism in the people. But Mary died under the impression that the situation had been met, and that the national religion, to which the great majority of Englishmen still adhered, was no longer in grave or imminent peril. Queen Elizabeth. The interest of Queen Elizabeth to the historian is mainly biographical, but it is also the interest of a myth. The interest is mainly biographical because she was of very little effect upon the history of her time. We do not find any great political events produced by her will or her intelligence, and there is nothing important in the Europe of her time or the England of her time of which we can say, this was done by Elizabeth. But the woman herself is so interesting, not only as a pathological case, but as an example of suffering and intelligence combined, of a warped temperament and all that goes with it, that, biographically, she was a first-rate subject, and one which, it may be added, has never been properly dealt with. There is no one well-known book which gives an approximately true picture of Elizabeth, at least none in the English language. The reason of this is due to the presence of what other interest in her character, the myth. What may be called the Elizabethan myth is only now beginning to break down, and it was during the 19th century an article of faith in England, and through England elsewhere. It was one of the most perfect modern examples of its kind in all the range of history. It is a sort of creative and vital falsehood, radiating its effects upon all the details of the time, and putting in the wrong light pretty well everything what happened. The Elizabethan myth may be stated thus. In the second half of the 16th century, England had the good fortune to be governed by a woman of strong will, powerful intelligence, and excellent judgment, whose power was supreme. Her people adored her, and produced in her time, and largely under her influence, the greatest figures in every sphere: literature, architecture, foreign politics, and the rest. She chose her ministers with admirable skill, and they served her with corresponding faithfulness. In consequence of all this, the great queen led the nation through paths of increasing prosperity. It grew wealthier and wealthier as her reign proceeded, more and more powerful abroad, founding colonies and establishing that command of the sea which England has never since lost. In religion, she wisely represented the strong Protestantism of her people, in hatred of which a few venomous rebels, shamefully allied with foreigners, attacked her reign and even her life. However, she easily triumphed over them all, and died full of glory, leaving her name as that of the greatest of the English sovereigns. There, in brief, is the Elizabethan myth, and a more monstrous scaffolding of poisonous nonsense has never been foisted on posterity. I use the word poisonous, not at random, not as a mere epithet of abuse, but with a full sense of its accuracy. For this huge falsehood, which might be merely absurd in another connection, has had, applied to English history, all the effect that a poison has upon a living body. It has interfered with the proper scale of history. It has twisted, altered, and denied the most obvious historical truths, and has given Englishmen, and even the world at large, a false view of our past. The myth is now beginning to break down. It could not survive detailed and critical work. Moreover, I perceive a danger that in its breakdown there will be too strong a reaction the other way, and that men, when they find out how they have been duped, will run to the opposite extreme, and perhaps come to believe that Elizabeth was insignificant. Whatever she was not that. Her position was weak, but she herself was not weak. The truth about Elizabeth is this. She was the puppet or figurehead of the group of new millionaires, established upon the loot of religion begun in her father's time. They had at their head the unique genius of William Cecil, who, in spite of dangerous opposition, accomplished what might have seemed the impossible task of digging up the Catholic faith by the roots from English soil, stamping out the Mass, and shepherding the younger generation of a reluctant people into a new religious mood. Throughout her life, Elizabeth was thwarted in each political effort she made. She felt the check of her masters, and especially Cecil, as a horse feels the bridle. She never had her will in matters of state. In personal history, the truth about Elizabeth is that she was a woman of strong will, and warped by desperately bad bodily health, and almost certainly by a secret abnormality which forbade her to bear children. This wretched health, to which half a dozen times in her life she nearly succumbed, partly accounted for a mind also diseased on the erotic side. It is not a pleasant subject, and not one on which I can dwell at length in these pages, but it must be very strongly emphasized, for it accounts for all her intimate life and all that was most characteristic of her from her 15th year. Her relations with men were continual, but they were not normal, and they were the more scandalous for that. Like others, who have suffered the same tragic disease of perversion in mind and body, it seemed to increase upon her with age. Already within sight of the grave and approaching her 70th year, she was shamefully associated with one whom she had taken up as a lad, a young fellow nearly 33 years her junior. Her intellect was high and piercing. She had real wit, very full instruction in many languages, and her will, in spite of perpetual rebuffs, remained strong to the end, though woefully impotent to carry into effect. No one chafed more or suffered more under the domination of others than Elizabeth, and no one has had to accept it more thoroughly. She had, on this side of the intelligence and of the will, one only weakness, but that so exaggerated that it was hardly sane. She insisted upon flattery, and particularly upon flattery which was so exaggerated as to be absurd. She certainly was not taken in by it, but she seems to have had a maniac appetite for it, liking it the more she knew it to be absurd. When she had long been dried up and wizened, with a skin like parchment, already old but looking a far older ruin than she was, she insisted upon her flatterers addressing her as though she were a woman of great beauty, in the bloom of youth. Elizabeth was never beautiful, and after the age of 30 she became repulsive. In that year she lost all her reddish hair through an illness, and had to supply the loss by a reddish wig. Her complexion had never been good since the first years of her youth, but she carried herself with dignity, and in spite of her physical disabilities, her energy and vivacity of mind certainly made her a good companion. So far from her reign being the foundation of England's modern power or anything of that sort, it was a period during which, as Thorold Rogers has proved, wealth was continually declining, towns shrinking in population and land going out of cultivation. It is true that a race of bold seamen rose contemporaneously with that reign, but they were no more remarkable than the captains of other nations in Europe at the same time, and they nearly all bore the taint of theft and murder. They were slave dealers and pirates, secretly supported by the powerful men of the state. Elizabeth could not but feel the shame which their piracies brought upon her in the eyes of her fellow sovereigns, and yet could not avoid taking part in the proceeds of the disgraceful business. For Cecil's principle was to let such men as Hawkins, Drake, and the rest rob indiscriminately, to disavow them in public, to apologize for their acts, sometimes even to compensate the victims in part, but to keep the gains of their misdeeds, much the greater part of which went into the pockets of the men who held political power, while the criminal agents themselves were left with no more than a small commission. The only military effort of the reign, that in Holland, was a ridiculous failure. The only effort at colonization that was equally ridiculous failure of Virginia. In religion, Elizabeth inclined at first to that witty, cynical skepticism of the Renaissance, the spirit of many intellectuals of the time in which she was steeped. She was ready in youth to adopt any outward conformity required of her. Calvinist as a girl, under the rule of those who were despoiling the state after her father's death, she was quite ready to profess enthusiasm for the Catholic Church, as we have seen when her sister Mary was on the throne, but secretly enjoying the influence given her by the fact that the religious revolutionaries looked to her as a counterweight against her sister, and as one who, when they could put her upon the throne, would make certain of their ill-gotten gains at the expense of the Catholic Church. As she grew older, she developed a certain measure of carefully concealed piety. Her private prayers prove that. It is a feature not uncommon in people who are tortured by some abnormality in their intimate life. It is a sort of refuge with them. Her mature sympathies were, of course, however vaguely, with the Catholic Church. All the great monarchs among whom she wished to be counted as an equal were struggling to maintain the old civilization of Europe, of which the Catholic faith was the creator and the supreme expression. Philip of Spain, head of the Catholic movement, had saved her life. She had long respected and depended upon him until, in spite of her and in spite of himself, Cecil had turned him into an enemy. She tried hard for an understanding with the papacy. She detested the new Anglican establishment which Cecil had put up, and of which she was, in spite herself, the political head. It was one of those very few minor points on which she was allowed to have her own way that she refused to call herself, as her father had called himself, the vicar of Christ and supreme head of the church on earth. She detested the idea of unmarried clergy and always refused to receive the wives of the new establishment. She would, had she been allowed, have sent emissaries to the Council of Trent. And though, of course, the thing cannot be proved and it is pure conjecture, I have thought it certain enough that she would, in the case of a successful Catholic rising, had the Catholic emigrants and their supporters been able to bring a sufficient force into England, have joined what was still the religion of the majority of her subjects, though cowed and terrorized by the reign of Cecil's government. The fall of that government would have been indeed a release for her. An example of the way in which she was run by those who were her masters, I will take 4 leading cases out of a very great number which might be quoted. 1. She had personally given her royal assurance to the Spanish minister that the Spanish treasure ships bearing the pay for Alva's soldiers in the Netherlands, the ships which had taken refuge from pirates in English harbors, should be released and the money taken under safeguards to its proper destination. Cecil simply overruled her. He ordered the money to be kept and confiscated in spite of her, and his orders, not hers, were obeyed. 2. Again she desired to save Norfolk. 3 separate times she interfered to prevent the execution. She was overruled. That unfortunate cousin of hers was put to death, but his blood is not upon her head, it is upon Cecil's. She tried to recall Drake just before the open declaration of war with Spain. No one thought of obeying her orders in the matter. The supreme example is the case of Mary, Queen of Scots. The murder, for it was a murder, was accomplished against her will. Our official historians have perpetually repeated that her agony at hearing of Mary's death was feigned. That is, false. It was genuine. The signing of the warrant had indeed been wrung out of her. But that did not mean that the warrant would be put into execution. It was put into execution in spite of her, in order that she should be made responsible, willing or unwilling. One might add to the list at any length. Her paramour, Leicester, did what he willed in Holland without consulting her, keeping a royal state which she flamed against impotently. Her later paramour, Essex, kept the loot of Cadiz and defied, without fear of consequences, her bitter anger at finding herself deprived of her royal right to the proceeds of an act of war undertaken in her name. She never desired the death of Essex. It was Robert Cecil, the second Cecil, who was responsible for Essex's death. Not only would she have prevented it if she could, but one may fairly say that she died for it. And to what a death did the unhappy woman come? A death of madness and despair. The late Hugh Benson wrote a most powerful pamphlet contrasting that death with the holy, happy, and pious death of Mary. She crouched on the ground for hours, one may say for days, refusing to speak, with her finger in her mouth, after having suffered horrible illusions, thinking she had an iron band pressing around her head, and on one occasion seeing herself in a sort of vision as a little figure surrounded with flames. She passed unannealed, unabsolved, and it is one of the most horrible stories in history. Nevertheless, we must admit her greatness, a warped, distorted, diseased greatness, but greatness nonetheless. And there is another note on which I would conclude, a note of warning, which is always necessary when one is correcting a false impression in history. The issue was not clear-cut. It must ever be so when the real power is in one hand, the nominal power in the other. It is the nominal power which impresses men, and even those who exercise the real power half believe in it, and those who exercise the nominal power also more than half believe in it. Cecil would never have told you that he was the real master of England, and even though upon a strict examination of conscience he would have had to admit it, he still regarded himself a minister and servant. And she herself, Elizabeth, was of course filled with the idea of her office to the end, that ideal of monarchy which men still held. Yet it was under her that the monarchy of England began to fall to pieces so rapidly that within half a lifetime after her death, the rich taxpayers not only rose in rebellion successfully against the crown, but put their monarch, her second successor, to death. With that event, the beheading of Charles I, the old English monarchy came to an end, and it remained nothing but a simulacrum of itself. Government had passed to the gentry, and to their great communities, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Some day, I suppose, a true life of Elizabeth will be written in the English language, but, as I have said, we have not had it yet. There is here a great opportunity for the younger historians, and one of them, I think, will take it.